Since long before the dawn of recorded history, the organisation of large numbers of humans, what we call civilization, has been made immensely easier by access to transport over water. From floating crops and skins on raft to the Cape-sized cargo ships of the 21st century, rivers, lakes, coasts, seas and eventually oceans have been the key to trade, and from trade, wealth. Losing a major battle at sea, with it the resulting loss of access to the trade routes, has spelled the death of empires through the ages. In this series, we will explore the hundreds of naval battles that have shaped the world we live in. Let's start at the beginning. At least 130,000 years ago, humans began to inhabit islands like Crete in the eastern Mediterranean. While evidence and records of maritime technology are scant to non-existent in prehistory, we can draw some conclusions from this settlement. Firstly, it takes a reasonably sophisticated maritime culture to take to open water with their families and possessions, to set up shop over the horizon. Secondly, we can assume that navigation techniques existed, again, if only because you're not going to sail away from your home, your people, and your family if you can't be reasonably confident of finding your way home at least most of the time. The Polynesian mariners of the South Pacific, albeit from a different tradition, are proof that sophisticated open water navigation, including sailing into the wind, are possible with relatively simple tools and materials. History's chroniclers, however, have tended to go to sea rarely, and mariners kept their secrets to themselves. In these early battles, we're going to have to make a lot of guesses. The Battles of Alashiya took place at some point between 1275 BC and 1205 BCE. The final conclusive battle appears to have taken place in 1210 BCE, but records are what's carved in stone years after the event. It was the first battle at sea that is mentioned in a record which survives to the present day. It was almost certainly not the first time ships at sea came into conflict with each other. The fact that the protagonists, the Hittite Empire and the Kingdom of Alashiya, even possessed the means to wage war at sea is a fair indicator of past conflicts. But every story has to start somewhere. The Kingdom of Alashiya was based in what we today call Cyprus in the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittites were a continental superpower based on what today we'd call eastern Turkey and Syria. So even at this early stage, we have the Turks fighting over Cyprus. Even right here at this beginning of the story, it's about the maritime power versus a continental one. The fact that this theme keeps recurring might owe something to neither side truly understanding the very different demands of power at sea and on land. Sometimes the maritime power wins, sometimes they're overwhelmed, but war at sea throughout history has been driven by this mismatch of objectives and understanding. There are a tiny number of engravings of Hittite warships. We can only assume the Alashians had similar technology. The pattern seems reasonably familiar. From the Greek galleys to the Viking longships to the galleasses of Lepanto, the form lasted millennia. Low and long, with rows of oars, a sail to coast downwind, upwind sailing being an issue of hot debate, and possibly a ram. What even makes something a warship? In contrast to what? If merchant shipping is designed to carry people and goods, then seaworthiness, cargo capacity, and minimal crewing are the driving design imperatives for profitable shipping. Keeping the crew count down is an overwhelming imperative of naval and maritime design throughout the millennia. A warship of this era then needs to be faster than the merchant ships, that's relative, and able to overwhelm the crew and passengers of its victims. A capacity to overwhelm another warship is, we can assume, something to worry about for later naval battles. It is reassuring that the few engravings of Hittite warships match our guesses as to what would have made a warship in this period. The ram on the front, now there's an interesting subject. Chroniclers, as we've said, are notoriously bad at understanding anything about ships of their period. And in particular, what rams were supposed to be doing on ships. And this also goes to the people on land who are drawing pictures or particularly making engravings, which is the only real records that we have. Sometimes they'll strike a coin. Again, that's not a mariner's representation. When ships were built with simple construction, placing the strength in the outer hull, a ram was tremendously damaging. A good hit could cause a ship to break up. Later keel and rib construction of ships was much more resistant to hits from a ram, in that the ram could penetrate the hull, but the strength of the ship was in the keel and the ribs, and that would not have been damaged. So you have a hull, but fundamentally ships are built of wood floats. A hull is not good, but it's nowhere near the same as when these ships were built with the strength mostly built into the outer hull, and therefore much more vulnerable to a ram. Later keel and ribs construction still kept the ship very vulnerable to having the oars cut, though. So that's why rams later moved into being above the waterline, where they were much more intended to cut the enemy's oars than they were to necessarily plough into the side of the enemy ship. Imagine heaving on the oars of a gallery, packed in with the rest of the crew, when the weight of the enemy ship smashed through those oars. The splinters, the wild crashing of the oars in the confined space, it would have been a profound emotional event. In the Battles of Alashiya, the Hittites sought to carry an army to Cyprus from Syria, eastern Turkey, to overwhelm that kingdom. The Cypriots sought to destroy the Hittite fleet, apparently after it had landed the army ashore. Destroying the fleet still has immense value, because if the army can't be resupplied, then it might well be possible to overwhelm them on the beachhead. The Hittite emperor, and you'll have to excuse my pronunciation here, the Hittite emperor Suppiluliuma II led the landing force and is remembered by history as the first victor of a sea battle, despite some unnamed Hittite being the admiral at sea who did the fighting and the winning. Suppiluliuma would disappear, possibly fighting the Sea Peoples around 3 years later. To the extent that the Hittites are relatively known today due to their mentions in the Bible, and the kingdom of Alashiya is largely unknown, suggests that in this round at least, the continental power had a major victory at sea. Although the Bronze Age collapse could be called a little bit of a square-up. As you might expect, we'll be hearing more from the Sea Peoples in future episodes. This has been a relatively simple episode, as we know almost nothing except that the battle occurred and the Hittites won. More episodes to come. We've got a lot of ground to cover as we take on every naval battle in history.